So they sort of work really as far as, they were able to observe, they were able to analyze, but also record lessons themselves. And also they were able to do this kind of work really in the absence of, electricity or, lack of connectivity. So we are very, very proud really of the initiative we started. But as I said initially, really, it was started by, the university, but also led, other collaborators came in later on, as I said, led by Professor Risnik. But also, coming back really to the purpose of this, of this meeting today, as I said, we take pride really in making a minimal contribution as far as topical issues are concerned, as far as trying to make education more practical, more relevant, but also do our best as a Wits School of Education to contribute really to higher education in general, but also to the national project, but most importantly to collaborate where we can and where possible really with colleagues, nationally, regionally, and abroad. As I said initially, we see this as part and parcel of fostering community engagement and also promoting community participation. I think with those words, Chairperson, I would like to welcome everyone who's attended this lecture. I'm looking forward to hear Professor Adler's presentation, and let's enjoy presentation, colleagues. Then we'll hopefully take questions, and if there are comments at the end just before we break. Thanks, Chair. Over to you.
Thank you, Tukazani. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for being part of this prestigious event, a calendar event of SAERA. Where we invite a distinguished speaker, but I'll tell you more about the lecture just now a little bit more. But just to give you a warm welcome and hope that every one of you are safe and well, and we pay our respects to those academics that have lost their lives due to the pandemic, as well as their friends and relatives who were impacted or inflicted by the COVID-19. We would have loved to have this lecture in person, but due to circumstances of COVID, we felt that it's best to do it through virtual spaces. So despite your busy schedule, we really welcome you to the session. We hope that you will contribute to the discussions and debates unfolding and get inspirations from the works of Nelson Mandela. So we want to also thank Wits School of Education for hosting our annual conference, and today marks the beginning of it. We have started the conference early this morning with some workshops, pre-conference workshops, and we head into the conference main program tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. And we invite you to be part of that conference for the next 2 days. So details of the conference is on our website. So if you don't have invites or if you don't know the program, please access the programs at our website. So again, thanks to the Wits School of Education for again hosting this Nelson Mandela Legacy Lecture. So the South African Education Association is a research association with several objectives, one of which is to establish a cohesive, coherent, and inclusive research identity through which it can harness and promote vigorous and responsive discussions and debates to ignite intellectual and research endeavors to promote and sustain a vibrant and influential national education research through the platforms that it established. This legacy lecture is one of its annual calendar events that contributes to this intellectual research identity by providing a platform to acknowledge influential people who have made substantive contributions to education with a view to inspiring others. The late Nelson Mandela's address to the country in 2003, in which he said, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world," really articulates the profound value that you found in education for the betterment of people, especially the impoverished and the marginalized. So the South African Education Research Association hosts a feature lecture annually as a precursor to its annual conference. The theme of this year's conference, Education for Inclusivity and Sustainability in Times of Increasing Inequalities, hosted by the Wits School of Education, fits squarely within what the late President Nelson Mandela envisaged in his 2003 address to the nation. For the Nelson Mandela Legacy Lecture, SAERA, in conjunction with the host of the conference, chooses a compelling speaker to address the following questions. What does Nelson Mandela mean for the great task of education? What might one take away from a study of his writings, his speeches, and his actions? Is there a Mandela approach to education? One frequently cited example is a comment he made in The Long Walk to Freedom, that education is the great engine of personal development. It is through education that the daughter of a peasant can become a doctor, that the son of a mine worker can become the head of the mine, that a child of a farm worker can become the president of a great nation. It is what we make out of what we have, not what we are given, that separates one person from another. I think that substantial quote will forever be our guiding force as we move along. So such quotes are often open to deconstruction in timeless context. Hence, in this lecture series, our distinguished speaker, which all of you would know, Professor Jill Adler, will engage with how Mr. Mandela's legacy might be drawn on for having an educational discussion. We ask the speaker to consider what would make Mandela educational as opposed to simply or just inspirational. How, to add, does one make Mandela a catalyst for reimaginations rather than tranquilizing balm for which he is used often? How does one draw on him as a site of provocation for thinking about oneself, thinking about self in others, and thinking about self in the world? How does one say the name Mandela and in it find the stepping off points for questions about things that matter in our lives, individually, in solidarity, which we make, and in our relationship to the wider universe? The compelling and distinguished speaker for today's lecture is none other than Professor Jill Adler. And I think all of you here have some connections with her. So I'm going to give a very brief introduction, knowing that you all know the substantive contributions that she has made over the years, being A-rated scientist within our country. So Professor Jill Adler, amongst other great attributes, is a professor of mathematics education at the University of Witwatersrand, and she is a visiting professor of mathematics education at King's College, London, UK. She was the president from 2017 to 2020 of the International Commission on Mathematical Instructions and held the SARChI Mathematics Education Chair at the University of Witwatersrand from 2010 to 2019. And as indicated, she's an A-rated researcher. So we would then like to invite Professor Jill Adler to engage with us on her insights on education, educational research, and draw inspirations for us to think mathematically and think within the context of Nelson Mandela's learnings and teachings and inspirations. Welcome, Professor Jill Adler. You need to unmute.
How many times has that been said? Please unmute. Yeah. Thank you, Lovey, for those kind words. And thank you, SAERA and the School of Education, the Wits School of Education, for this honor. It really is an immense honor to be giving this talk today. I'm going to share my screen so that I can get on with it as quickly as possible. There we go. So I changed the title slightly from Thinking with Mandela to Honoring His Legacy. But I am going to focus on what this means, what Nelson Mandela's legacy means for reflecting on acting to leave a change. So it really is about action. And I'm going to start off by drawing on some of his famous quotes to set the scene and really the framework for how I'm going to talk about what it means and can mean to lever educational change. Some of the things that are said here have been read by Lavi, but I'll just talk to them here. As he said, and this is in his speech, his an acceptance speech in 1994, we all know that education more than anything else improves our chances of building better lives. But he also said that rhetoric isn't important, actions are. And he also said, and we know this is at the end of the book of The Long Walk to Freedom, that after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. And we understand that there's no easy road to freedom, and there's no easy road to educational change. And we know well that none of us acting alone can achieve success, and I'll come back to those as I go through the talk. But the important thing I want to focus on is what he said about action and vision. That action without vision is only passing time, and vision without action is merely daydreaming. But vision with action can change the world. And for me, and thinking about this and drawing on his legacy, sorry, I've just got to move this is in the way. What I draw from having thought and spent a lot of the last while preparing this lecture is how important that vision and action are seen in interaction, and that they also involve responsibility. It's one of the things that he also said, is that with freedom comes responsibility. But most importantly, and I think his legacy is so profoundly this, is that all of this and all our actions and our visions are set in contexts. And these are the key elements, I think, of his legacy. And all of these things need to be connected. And there's some interesting way in which that is the way we named our project that I'm going to talk about, the Wits Maths Connect secondary project. It's about secondary mathematics. It is about connections. It's about connections between vision and action. It's about connections between research and practice, theory and practice, between teachers and researchers, between mathematics and students. What is so important is connectedness. Sorry. Not sure what's going on here. Sorry, something has frozen. Oh my goodness. Just bear with me for a second. There we go. Sorry about that. And also importantly, and this is what Lavia said, is that inspirational vision is not enough. It has to be realized through responsible action, derived and changed in context. And what I'm going to do in this lecture is draw on these ideas and these legacies to reflect on what were the lessons and challenges of the 10-year project from 2010 to 2019, a research-linked development intervention with lower secondary mathematics teachers and teaching. So this is the outline of the talk. I'm going to start by taking us back to 2010 as a reminder of what was happening when we started the project in its initial years, and then how we shifted emphases and practices to focus on what we call maths for teaching. And this is what I call the interaction between vision and action. I'll then talk about the controversies and complexities that were involved in actually getting the project going and making progress. What became the central change levers, a year-long course and a framework for teaching, some results of the project, and then going back to how does all this add up to honoring Nelson Mandela's legacy and perhaps climbing some foothills. So to begin with the context, I want to go back to 2010 and 2011 and the first years of the project. And of course, you will remember, I'm sure everybody online will remember that this was the time of shifting curriculum policy. So the 2009 report from the review team on curriculum 2005, moving to NCS, and this was the precursor to moving into CAPS, had just been published. And it's interesting to look at the last paragraph, actually, from that report, which says, we're not advocating a return to the past. I've selected bits from it. But what we are advocating is that an underspecified curriculum advantages those who already have access to knowledge needed to improve their life chances. And so we need more certainty and specificity about what to teach and how to teach, because this will help restore confidence and stability in the system and enhance learning opportunities. So that was the shift happening around curriculum policy. And I think we all know, and I'll point to later, is that one of the things that shifted towards was towards much more prescription in school curricula, annual teaching plans, and so on. But there was also at that time work happening on the policy on teacher education. And I've just pulled up some things from the executive summary, which I think are important to understanding the project and the context in which it was working at a policy level. What was interesting about what was said was that it was marked there that CPD, continuing professional development, is the responsibility not just of official departments, but a variety of role players, that there needed to be time deliberately scheduled for teachers to participate in continuing professional development. It's also interesting that they pointed out there about possibilities for self-assessment, diagnostic assessments around teacher knowledge and practice, so that teachers could know where they were, and that these assessments needed to be linked with professional development resources. It's interesting to look back to see that that was in this document. And they were calling for courses, interestingly enough, that were pedagogically sound, content-rich, curriculum-relevant, quality assured, and that these needed to be identified and developed. And I've pulled these out because it actually says that there was a receptive policy context in which we began the project. And what I mean by receptiveness is it was promoting partnerships, partnerships between universities and government departments. And while this was promoted, I think anybody who was doing work at that time will appreciate when I say it was not easy establishing a trusting relationship with particularly the Gauteng Education Department, which is where we worked closely. It evolved crucially, and within 5 years we had a very good working relationship with the department, but it wasn't a given. There was a lot of mistrust of universities actually offering what they thought was relevant continuing professional development. The other thing that's interesting here in terms of courses is that there was an acknowledgement there that actually one-off workshops for continuing professional developments don't work, and we all know that. But that was the policy context. So what about on-the-ground practices that we found as we went into the schools? And I'm going to go quickly through this because these are things people know, but I think it's useful to remind us. This was the performance curve in grade 12 in the early years of the project. Very high failure rates, very high low passes, and very few people obtaining reasonable results in mathematics. That meant access to tertiary study, access to engineering, access to the sciences. And so what this shows, and it was being talked about at that time, I think across the Commonwealth education, that we achieved access for all in terms of development goals, but only learning for some. And this was certainly true at the FET level, the further education and training level in South Africa. And so as we started out the project, the initial vision was, can we shift this curve? Can we try to shift the curve? Which means bring down the failures here. Can we bring this down? And can we push this up? And we know change is slow, but that was the initial vision that we set out with. But then, of course, we went into the schools. We spent most of 2010 in the schools without much intervention at all. We were working in 10 schools. That was the specification of the project remit, if you like. We were working in one district in Gauteng, and we were working with what we called no fee and low fee schools. They were not necessarily quintile 1 and quintile 2 only. There were some quintile 5 schools even that were very, very low fee, poor performing schools. And what did we find? As we would expect, there was high prescription, teaching was regulated, there was an emphasis on coverage, teachers were teaching to annual teaching plans. And conditions of work, Yael and Ursula Hoadley wrote, Yael Shalem and Ursula Hoadley wrote a very powerful paper for me in 2009 about the dual economy of schooling, where teachers are working with limited resources. These were material, technological, and human. And critically, learners were not prepared for the grade they were in. They're not academically prepared. So teachers are working, and we all know this. Low teacher morale. But the thing that we did find, and I'm not sure how well this was known, was the divide between the lower secondary and the senior secondary. It was structured into the curriculum where we had senior phase and FET. You had different subject advisors for GET and for FET. And what we found in the school was a divide, that there was a lot of emphasis in the school, particularly in mathematics on grades 10, 11, and 12, when the FET mathematics curriculum started, and not much emphasis or concern really with what was going on in grade 8 and 9. And that was given vivid illustration in 2010 when we had the FIFA World Cup followed by a teacher strike. So there was 6 or 7 weeks where schools were closed, and we came back to the schools, interacted with teachers, heads of departments, and a catch-up program, whereas in all the schools, all 10 schools, was arranged for grades 11 and 12 and nothing for grades 8 and 9. And for us, that was already a warning bell about some of the problems in the schools. When we looked at results, what we found, and this was written about at that time, is a very, very serious bulge in grade 10. So what was happening is students were being pushed through from grade 8 and 9 with very poor mathematics into grade 10, failing grade 10 mathematics. And so you had a huge bulge in grade 10. And so what we were seeing is the transition from the GET to the FET in mathematics in the schools that we were working with was very, very problematic, exacerbated structurally. Inside classrooms, we spend time observing teaching. And in the lower grades in particular, less so in the upper grades, but we found what we called incoherence. And that is what, and how we referred to that is that the object of learning was out of focus. In a maths lesson, there's some mathematics that is intended to be taught. Well, what was that? Sometimes we sat in lessons, there were lessons happening, students were paying attention. It wasn't as if there was misbehavior or teaching wasn't happening, but it was hard to come away from those lessons and figure out what was it about, even though what looked like mathematics was going on. And what we talked about in terms of it being incoherent is there wasn't really a mathematical story that could capture students' imagination, their thinking, and their meaning making. We started paying a lot more attention then in grade 8 and 9. And also what we did in 2010 was we did some diagnostic assessment ourselves, just a basic algebra test that we used that was developed in the UK. Algebra is so important in the secondary curriculum. It's if you don't have a grasp of the algebraic symbolic system, it's almost impossible to make progress up the curriculum. And I won't go into any of the mathematical details, but we found that the foundations were poor and unstable, very poor and unstable, even in grade 10. And what we also found in the schools is that many teachers teaching in grade 8 and 9 were not necessarily mathematically trained. We call these out of field teachers, and they were out of field in a number of ways. Some were primary trained and landed up in a secondary school. Some were trained in other subjects and were picking up because they had free time in their teaching schedule to pick up a class. And so they were picking up classes, and those would then be grade 8 and 9 teachers teaching grade 8 and 9 classes. And just to give you one sort of anecdote about some of the impact of this, in one of the schools, a very large school we were working with in Ivory Park, the grade 9 mathematics teacher was teaching all the grade 9 students, all of them, 500 of them. And she was primary trained, and her mathematics was exceptionally poor. I won't go into the details of how we know that, but it was both from observation, our working with her over a few years in the course. And this was part and parcel of creating some of the bulge then. The students were arriving in grade 10 even less prepared for grade 10, and so a very hard task for the EVT teachers. So it was no surprise to us when the ANNAs came, and this was the result for grade 9 learners in 2012. Okay. It was really no surprise for us, given our testing. I think it was a big shock across the country that it was so poor, but it wasn't a surprise for us. And this was our alert that this is what we needed to work in the grade 8 and 9. We needed to work lower down in the school. At the same time, I just want to speak very briefly about what are the circulating discourses in maths education. They overlap with education in general, and I'm going to talk about teaching and learning mathematics and then teacher education. These will be familiar to everybody. So what's promoted is active inquiry-based learning in mathematics, problem solving, or realistic mathematics. We go from the real world to the mathematical world and back again. Pedagogy must be learner-centered, and mathematics must be meaningful. And at the same time, what is happening is increasing politics on impact of international comparative assessments. In South Africa, we only do the TIMS, Trends in Mathematics and Science Studies, and people will know the results of those, where our results have been poor, though marginally increasing over the last 10 years. But in Europe, they also do what's called the PISA comparative assessments, and those really have an overarching structuring of curriculum, mathematics curricula internationally. Teacher professional development discourses, and I think this comes out of our strategy as well. We need teachers to be learning in professional learning communities. What's happening in the international terrain and in maths education is that it's very important that all professional development and teacher education needs to focus on the content of teaching. So mathematics teaching and not just general pedagogies. And there's all the work that people would know there, building on the work of Schulman by Deborah Ball and her colleagues on mathematical knowledge for teaching. What is the specialized mathematical and professional knowledge, and the importance in teacher learning for developing knowledge, practice, and identity, and not one without the others. And at the same time that these discourses were circulating, they were also expressed in dichotomous ways. So we needed active learning, not passive learning, which was rote or abstract. We needed learner-centered, not teacher-centered. And not learner-centered, need to be not meaningless, but meaningful. And what was happening certainly, and still happens in maths education, is a very strong emphasis on both curriculum and pedagogic reform in mathematics, and it was posed against traditional teaching. So these were dichotomies. And in mathematics, in my view, okay, and I think the view of many, not just mine, is that these dichotomies are problematic, because actually much of these ideas are interrelated in the practices of mathematics and in the practices of teaching. So a very prevalent one in mathematics is the dichotomy between procedures and concepts. We need conceptual learning, not procedural learning, but anybody who works in mathematics knows that these are deeply intertwined. And of course, what was happening in these with these discourses is that they were emerging in contexts with very different on-the-ground realities from what I've just described. But they were nevertheless percolating and filtered into our curricula, into our debates, and into discourses circulating around our practices. So with that as a kind of background, and we faced trying to work in the schools, there were a number of things that happened in the first 2 years. And 2011, as we really started to try to do PD in the schools. So the first thing I talked about is that actually the project should have been aimed at improving the results in grade 12 at FET level, and we needed to shift. So we changed the direction of the project to focus on grades 8 and 9 and the transition into grade 10 and the structural disconnect that we'd found. We try to work in the schools in not one-off workshops, but in what we called thematic ways, working on, mathematics and mathematics teaching that was relevant, but it became more and more evident that it was not possible to work in schools in productive ways, and also that we were finding at the lower levels there were significant gaps in teachers' knowledge. And the controversy here is that actually the discourse is you can't talk about deficits. So how do we talk about what it was that we needed to do with teachers so that we could enable and offer them opportunities to participate with mathematics, opportunities that we thought many of them had never had before. And to do that, we needed mathematics as opposed to pedagogy or teaching as the organizing principle for the PD. What we found in the schools as well was that there was a strong culture of what we called no learning without teaching. In the first year, we were staggered at how much teaching was going on. Students were coming before schools to catch up after schools. There were Saturday classes, there were school holiday classes, and there was almost no time to think. And it was a culture of that you learn when you're taught, not you learn when you're trying to think yourselves. And this was a culture that we wanted to disrupt, that learning actually happens when you struggle over things, and you can't do that if you're actually in class all the time being taught. And at the same time, although teaching was so visible, it was invisible, it was opaque. I don't think it was the way and what were the problems with teaching were not possible to be seen. And so what we needed to do at the same time was then make teaching much more visible. And this is a real tension. If you make it more visible, then you background learning. So we struggled with this tension all the time. But for us, it was very important that we needed to make teaching more visible so that teachers could think and reflect more clearly and carefully about their teaching. I already mentioned that this was a real tension, that we try to work in schools, it was just impossible. There was no time for learning, and the teachers had no time to work after schools. It was absolutely clear to us that we had to move the program and design a program that was that was on campus and away from the schools. And so a real tension then, and controversy really, because we know that good PD is meant to be practice-based and therefore linked very closely to practice and in school. And the other one that I want to mention is that, of course, and this comes back to my own past work about how important language resources are. And of course, all the schools there were multilingual classrooms, teachers were working informally in many languages, but our task was to develop mathematical communication in English. And so we did focus on that, and I'll come back to that as I go along. So it was with these controversies, if you like, that percolated all the time during 2010 and 2011, as we tried many things out in classrooms, trying very hard to do mathematics and teaching, to do pedagogically based work with teachers, to deal with both FET and GT, but it was quite clear we had to make changes. And this change came in 2012. And what I'm going to talk about now was what action we then took. What was the intervention that we thought would give some leverage in change? I'm going to talk about what and why. I'm not going to talk about how. When I talk about the project, I usually say how, but it gets very mathematical. So I'm not going to be talking about how, because they're not everybody online is in mathematics. So the central change lever, if you like, was two-dimensional. It was a year-long Maths for Teaching course, and I'm going to describe what that is, supported by a maths teaching framework. And I can see time is marching, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Our major goal was to impact on teachers' relationships with mathematics, and we structured a year-long course focused mainly on mathematics, but not mathematics as you would find in a typical mathematics course. It was geared towards teaching, and we focused separately then on teaching and teaching strategies, teaching skills, teaching resources. We required independent work so that teachers had time to work on their mathematics, and we did assess them. In phase 1, we worked with 45 teachers across 10 schools, as I mentioned, and in the second 5 years, we worked over 3 years with over 40 teachers at a time, but now across many more districts, so we expanded the program out. We tried to develop a model that was lean. There was no coaching, there was no in-school work, and so it was not expensive in that sense in terms of human resources. We did do some lesson study to help us develop our ideas about teaching. Oh God, I keep doing this, sorry. And what I want to show very, very briefly here is how this was responding. We were focusing on the transition from grade 9 to 10 and so on, grade 8 and 9, on the FET-GT breakdown, or if you like, or disconnect. We were focusing on mathematics. It was mathematics driven. We were not in school. We were trying to make teaching visible through a teaching framework, and we were working in English. This is just to give you a sense of what it looked like in the room and where the teachers worked. It was collaborative. It was teachers working as a community, learning with and from each other. And this was the framework that structured all our thinking in the course and structured the way we talked about teaching with teachers. Simply, the work of teaching is to teach something. We always teach something. We call that the object of learning. In practical terms, it's the lesson goals, what learners are to know and be able to do. And in mathematics, because mathematics is abstract, it always has to be exemplified and then elaborated. And it's exemplified through tasks. All tasks carry mathematical examples. They come in various representational forms because of the abstraction of mathematics. And the elaboration is use of words. The mathematics register has to develop, and there are particular ways of justifying reasoning in mathematics. And these were the key things that needed to inform a framework for teaching, and that informed our thinking about the PD. All of these flow from the object. If this is the object, what is the example set? What are the kind of representations that will bring this into focus? What is the important register around this, and how does this get developed? And what are the ways of reasoning mathematically around this goal? And of course, none of that matters if learners are not invited to participate in these practices, in these maths teaching practices. And the framework has been written up. And of course, those go back to form the object of learning. We talk about it as a boundary object because we turned it into a teaching framework where the language used in this is much more teacher friendly, and it works on teaching practices. And this is what is mediated in the course. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I want to just say briefly that one of the things that's happening in educational practice and is key to access is that materials and resources are very important, but there's a lot that's been written, and I know some of that's here, but certainly in the international terrain, is that sometimes the underlying rationales, the underlying workings of why these are the way they are not easily communicated and are not made explicit. And we worked very hard to be explicit about what it was we were doing. Mathematically, in terms of what we valued as teaching and what we valued as quality PD opportunities. We viewed mathematics as a network of scientific concepts, very socioculturally informed, powerful in generality, but opaque in its reified structures. And this was important because of the incoherence we saw, is that it was very important that we provided teachers an experience of dealing with mathematical objects and some appreciation of what these objects were and how to unpack them and repack them, unpack them for learners, repack them again. Teaching we saw as goal-directed, mediated by resources that were ultimately cultural, and that a coherent mathematical story matters in a lesson. And this was, of course, because these were out of focus. And I've talked about what are the important things about running PD that needed to be content focused over time, building of community. But what we did, and I think it's evident in the framework, is that we worked to strengthen current teaching and learning practices towards a vision, rather than work to disrupt what was crudely talked about as traditional or direct instruction. We did not try to disrupt direct instruction, but to rather work to improve it and to move towards other possibilities. So briefly, here are some results. I'm going to start with the quantitative results. We did a pilot, so we were really challenged by the board, by our advisory board, that so does it make any difference to learners? Does what you're doing with teachers make any difference to learners? And this was methodologically an extremely difficult study to get going, and I know my colleague Craig Punara is online. He directed the Learning Gains study. But the real challenge in studying professional development and being able to say you've levered change actually is to link learner change to teacher change, or learner change to specific teachers. And this, in schools that are not stable, becomes extremely, extremely difficult to do methodologically. We did a pilot in 2013 where we worked with 5 schools. We matched teachers in the schools, and there were many limitations to this, but we had very promising results from this. Just from the 5 schools, there were 21 teachers, 14 who'd been on the course, 7 who hadn't. And the learners who had been with teachers on the course, they made significant gains over the year, far more than those of the teachers who had not been of the course. And this was evidence of promise. It was not a strong enough study to claim more than that, but it was evidence that this kind of intervention of working with teachers' knowledge of mathematics and working with teachers' relationship to mathematics and to mathematics teaching in the way that we were held promise. It was a small sample, the scores were low, there were small gains, but nevertheless, it gave us the confidence to move into the second phase. And in the second phase, we did a much larger study. And because we wanted to link teachers and learners, we needed to also be able to make some claims based on strong methodologies that the teacher's knowledge had changed, because our theory of change, if you like, is that if teachers' knowledge improves, it will impact the gains made by learners. So we needed to be able to show that teachers' knowledge improves. Now, one of the ways you would do it is a pre and post test, but if we'd have pre-tested teachers with the test we wanted to give them at the end of the year, none of them would have come back. So we had to start with some entrance test for them so that we could see where they were and we knew where to start the course, but there was an exit test. So we called it a selection test and a final test. There were tremendous improvements that we can claim from these, that it had a statistically significant impact on the teachers' maths for teaching, and to bear in mind that the final test was much harder than the selection test. But that was important to show that the teachers did learn, and they learned what we intended that they learned. But what about their learners? So here you can see we took the cohort of teachers who worked with us in 2016 and 2017. There are the learning gains of the 2016 teachers. They are quite big, relatively speaking. There are the 2017 teachers, less so. And here was the comparison group. What's important is they don't start at the same place. And that's what is looked at to see the significance in the gains. What is really critical here that's been pointed out to us when we've presented this elsewhere is how much the gap was closed for the learners of the teachers who'd been on these courses. So the TM1 teachers in 2016 had a much greater impact than the 2017 teachers, and that is very interesting because it shows a delayed effect, that professional development has a delayed effect on learners, not an immediate and direct effect on learners. And there are the scores. So what's important is to say, well, what are the practical implications of these gains? And if you look at effect sizes, this was equivalent to 8 months of additional progress. And at grade 10 level, we had, in order to have enough students, we also took grade 10 students. It was equivalent to 6 months additional progress. There's a delayed impact, as I said. One of the things that's not so visible is that the gains were small. Although there were gains, they were small. And in fact, the end result for our learners was that they were still not up at the curriculum level we would have liked them to have been. They were for some of the content areas where we'd spend more time with teachers, but not across the curriculum. And so there is a question, well, you know, if you made small gains, you're starting off on a really low base. Does this matter? Is this really levering change? You're spending all this money, you're doing all this work, you're making a difference with the teachers, but are these gains enough? And I think the short answer I would have now is that, and this is Mandela's legacy, is that we take small steps. And these gains were significant, and these gains did make a difference. I want to leave time for questioning, so I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but what lies between the teachers' knowledge gains and the learning gains was, of course, what was happening to their practices in the classroom. And this was done by one of the things that was most, was the privilege of having a SARChI chair, is that we had full-time doctoral and postdoctoral fellows with us, and they were doing the qualitative research. The early research helped us figure out what was going on in the schools, how teachers were using and not using textbooks, what it meant to work with example sets and exemplification, what counted as a mathematical explanation. These were doctoral studies that helped us make progress. And postdoctoral studies started to look at teacher learning, particularly in the later years. Learning as identity, learning as changing identity, and identity resources. And we did a very nice lesson study in 2015 and 2016 with teachers from the first phase. And we could see from those what aspects of the program teachers took up very easily. So they were able to work much more carefully and deliberately on their practice with how they selected and sequenced examples, how the examples and tasks were closer to what they wanted the kids to learn and know. Explanatory communication was much more linked to their knowledge bases, and so that was a much more uneven set of progress. I was fortunate to have a postdoc who worked with me on the framework, Elena Ronda from the Philippines, and we were able to show various links between the quality of teachers' subject matter knowledge in the way that we valued it and their teaching practices in the way that we valued it. Just very briefly, and I think people will find this interesting, we did intend and we did try to do a pre and post video study. And the short answer was that we've not been able to get this published. It was extremely difficult to track teachers, keep them in focus. We started off with 21, but we landed up with only data for 9 who taught who we were able to have before they started the course or at the beginning of the course and the following year. There were significant methodological challenges in doing this kind of work. And so as to be able to show in some substantive way changes in practices. It was very varied. We only had single lessons. Contexts of teaching were unstable. The results were uneven and messy. And in fact, there's a whole group working now in maths education research in our main conference on why this kind of work is so difficult and so difficult to publish because it is so complex and so messy and uneven and full of fits and starts and full of failures and successes. But as I said, we did see patterns of much more deliberate use of the way mathematics was exemplified with students, and much less so the way it was substantiated, the way it was elaborated, that tended to correlate with teachers whose mathematics strengthened more. So how does all this relate to Mandela's legacy? Coming back to that, why is this not just a story about a project? And I struggled with this as I was preparing the lecture. And I hope I've tried to show that the link, the connection between vision and action is not trivial. It's a very, very complex one. And for me, Mandela's legacy is exactly about having the courage and the tenacity to stay with that in the conditions in which we and our teachers work and our learners learn. And we know, after climbing a great hill, we only find there many, many more hills to climb, and I'm going to end with this. I just want to end with that quote that I had at the beginning. We know well that it's not an individual who does this, and so I'm just going to flash the picture of everybody who worked on the project, docs, postdocs, administrative staff, without which this work couldn't have been done, and without which the vision of the SARChI Maths Education Chairs actually couldn't have happened. They were visionary in that we had money to do both research and professional development and grow people as researchers and PD providers. So back to all the challenges that we found, the shifts and the controversies, and say that was then, well, what now? And I think what I would say now is, given what we face because of COVID and what's happened with schooling, the difficulties that I think, the inequalities are worse. I think we all know that they've been exacerbated. I didn't show you the gaps between, in the TIMSS results, between grade 9 learners who are in fee-paying and no fee-paying schools. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. These gaps are only bigger. And it means it's not only a gaps between those who have access and those that don't, but the gaps of those that don't, what they have not had opportunity to learn in the last nearly 2 years now, has only increased, has only exacerbated. And we were working towards the end of the project, and Craig Pinaro is working on this now, is what does it mean to work with teachers on learner knowledge gaps, which I don't know how we talk about that. It sounds deficit in many ways. You know, why don't we just start where they are? And you do, but you still have to figure out how teachers are going to do this, as well as what a core curriculum might be. And I think those are going to be the significant challenges going forward. So with that, a few little quotes. It always seems impossible until it's done. And I can tell you, we had many days when we thought it's not possible to continue with some of the challenges we found in the schools. But being optimistic is really important. You just keep one foot forward, and that's what we did. And I love this. Tread softly, breathe peacefully, and laugh hysterically. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Adler. Colleagues, I'm mindful of the time. Can I check with the chair? Prof, did you suggest we do what? We go over the time, we get questions and probably have a...
Look, I'll be happy to. I'm sorry, I prepared.
That's fine, Prof.
Yeah, I prepared 40 minutes, but we only started at 5:20. So I'm sorry I ran into...
No, that's fine. No need to apologize, Prof. I just want to make sure that we don't lose people in the process. I just want to check with the chair.
It's fine for us to go around 15 minutes into the program.
15?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, thanks, Prof. All right, colleagues, any contributions, questions, to the Prof? I'm looking for hands, like knowledge. It's fun. Perhaps we'll take the first three. Then allow Prof to comment or answer if there are any questions, then we go for second round in that order. 15 minutes, Prof, you said, right? That's all.
Sure.
Okay, let's pass. Okay. Prof Ramrata, please, if you identify, and I don't see any hands at this moment.
Carol?
Oh, yes, Carol. Okay. Carol, please. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Jill, so much for that really interesting input. I'm really interested in how the teachers kind of got to be chosen or selected. You said you worked very closely with the district. Did the district's kind of subject advisors tell teachers that they had to be involved, or how did you kind of get teachers to spend all this time and to engage? Was it something they were very willing to do? I'd just be interested a little bit around that.
It's a very, very good question, Carol. Should we take a few and then I'll answer, or if there aren't any others, then I can go.
I don't see any hand. You can proceed.
So in the beginning, in the first year, we identified 10 schools. And what we did is that in the district, we invited about 15, I can't remember, it was about 15 schools to say, did they want to participate in the project? And the schools had to motivate why they wanted to participate. And what we were looking for and asking for was a committed principal and a committed head of department, and a head of department who would then bring teachers along. So in the first 5 years, we had buy-in from the 10 schools, not from all the teachers in the schools. We were working in 10 schools. We only reached 45 teachers, certainly not all the teachers in the schools. And so it was absolutely voluntary. We had a tense relationship with the department, in the sense that the department would have liked us to do, there are many things that I could go into in terms of how we selected the schools, how we selected the teachers, because the teachers had to apply eventually to come on the course, and we tested them. And in the beginning, we let all the teachers who wanted to come on the course, but we found in the first 2 years, the teachers whose knowledge was really very, very weak got no traction. They didn't progress. The course started off somewhere too hard mathematically for them. And it was a really interesting discussion with the department that a different kind of PD was needed for teachers. I mean, what was so distressing for me is that those teachers were teaching grade 8 and 9 in the school. And this was the argument of the department. We needed to work with them. And I said, that's not our problem. That's the province's problem. That's the district's problem. We could only do what we could do, and we needed to work where we could leave a change. We couldn't leave a change with some of the teachers, and that, I think that's something that's not often talked about. And it was a very, very difficult process of doing that. When we went into the second phase, we invited districts, made contact with districts and invited them to participate in the project, and they identified teachers, but it was all voluntary. And the teachers needed to be released from school. So it was a partnership between the school, us, and the teachers themselves. They had to invest time. They were released from school to do this. This was quite controversial and a little bit under the covers, if you like, because it wasn't really allowed. But they were released from school. They came on Thursdays and Fridays. So, once every 2 months. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Very, very helpful. Thanks, Jill.
Okay. Thank you, Carol. I acknowledge Yvonne. Over to you. Yvonne, I saw your hand. I see your hand is up.
It is, but
you can take a platform, please.
Unmute.
Sorry, my unmuting wasn't going very well. Thanks, Thokozani. And Jill, thank you so much. Very, very fascinating and inspiring, and this from a non-mathematician, as you know. But one of the things I was particularly interested in was your saying that you decided quite deliberately to not disrupt teachers' current practices in the way that has often happened in other projects, including one that you and I were involved in long ago, but to start where the teachers were at with their current practices. So to do that, did you work from the observations that you made in the first year of the project and structure the program from that observation knowledge? I'm just fascinated by how you went about it.
So yeah, the short answer is yes, is that so teachers were working with prescription. Okay, they were working with annual teaching plans, and as the project progressed, they were working with daily scripted lesson plans. Not all of them were using them, but I think there's been enough research to show that actually if teachers are not understanding what the rationales behind all of these are. They don't necessarily make sense of these, and following them directly doesn't mean that they can make the links. So for us, it was about bringing into focus with them. We started with them when we worked on the so first of all, it was, if you don't have a sense of what a mathematical idea is, what a mathematical concept is, then it's impossible to communicate that. If you don't have an idea of why mathematical procedures are not disconnected steps that are derived, they follow logically using mathematical reasoning, then procedures just become rote. And so we didn't try to disrupt the teaching of procedures as such, but to make them more meaningful, to make concepts, to enable them to teach conceptually. And there were strategies that we used to do that. So we used variation theory. There are things that I haven't gone into here, that there were strategies that we used both in how we taught and how we taught mathematics, or we engaged them with mathematics in the course. And then we transmitted, if you like, what we valued as good mathematics teaching. Now, we say we didn't disrupt. Of course we disrupted, but not in the way that reform teaching was asking. So it wasn't about asking them to start out with an open problem, explore and get learners to give responses, then pull those responses and draw the mathematics out. You need mathematical sophistication to be able to do that. And in fact, we knew from Curriculum 2005, when that kind of practice is laid on weak knowledge bases, specialized knowledge disappears. So our concern was to lay much more conceptual foundations in what they were doing. And Yvonne, I can have a long story with you about how we did that. Okay, but not in 2 minutes here.
No,
yeah.
Thanks so much, Jill. That's wonderful.
Thank you, Yvonne, for the question. Thank you, Prof, for the response. I don't see any hands. Speak again. I don't see any hands. Okay. Colleagues, looks like this brings us to an end of this lecture. I think let me take this opportunity on behalf of the local organizing committee to thank Professor Adler for honoring Nelson Mandela's legacy and agreeing to do this lecture, 2021 SAERA in Nelson Mandela legacy. But also to thank the SAERA executive for keeping the national debates, engagement, going. But most importantly, colleagues, to acknowledge your presence, for the questions, comments that you've made. And without you, really, this lecture wouldn't really be possible. I think, Chair, I will hand over to you now if perhaps you have the last word to make or any announcement or anything of the sort. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zane. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again, for gracing us with your presence in this distinguished lecture. And we do hope that you would keep the conversation going, that you will use Mandela's inspirations to begin to make small changes to education so that they accumulate and at some point be able to make substantive changes as we go along. I'm reminded by Michael Apple, who talks about disruption, recording, and moving along. Disruption, recording, and moving along, and continuing that until it snowballs into such a forceful disruption that we are forced to then get changes made so that we can realize them. So with those words, I'd like you to continue with the conversation. We'd like you to engage more with the activities of SAERA, to take forward some of the objectives of SAERA through your individual communities of practice, to get involved with the SIG activities of SAERA, and that we build a prolific and robust research platform to inform research and practice within the country to make education better and accessible to all. So with those few words, thank you very much. And we hope that you would join the conference and contribute to the conference in substantive ways. All the best and take care. And thank you, Jill, for presenting a wonderful presentation. And we really appreciate the kind of clarity that you brought to it, the challenges that you've illuminated, and we all, although we understand it, but the way in which you presented it kind of illuminated the challenges that we all face as we engage in educational research for change. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to all the talks tomorrow.
Great.
Thank you, colleagues. Okay, stay safe, keep well, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Right. Thanks, Ibn.